Hello, I'm Dr. Terry Susan Fine, Content Specialist for the Florida Joint Center for Citizenship, which is part of the School of Politics, Security, and International Affairs at the University of Central Florida in Orlando. Welcome to our Middle School Civics Highlights series. We're going to be focusing on Benchmark 2.4, where we will explain how the U.S. Constitution and the Bill of Rights safeguard individual rights. In Part 1, we will be focusing on recognizing and describing rights that are protected and limited by the U.S. Constitution, including the Bill of Rights. Here, students will recognize that rights are protected, but some rights are limited, including property rights and civil disobedience. We will also examine rationales for government-imposed limitations on individual rights. These would include forced internment in wartime, limitations on speech, rationing during wartime, and suspension of habeas corpus. So why are some rights protected, but others are limited? What are the rationales for government-imposed limitations on individual rights, such as forced internment in wartime, limitations on speech, rationing during wartime, and suspension of habeas corpus? So we're going to be looking at a quote from a U.S. Supreme Court opinion in 1919. And this gets us to the question of why are some rights protected, but other rights are limited? The name of the case is Skank versus United States. Now, it may look like Shank, but it's actually pronounced Skank. U.S. Supreme Court Associate Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes was responsible for writing the majority opinion in Skank versus United States. And the quote says this: "The most stringent protection of free speech would not protect a man in falsely shouting fire in a theater and causing a panic." So imagine if you were in a dark room with other people seated in rows. There might be 1 or 2 aisles in this movie theater. It's dark so that you can see the movie, and someone screams fire. Well, naturally, the question is, how do I get out of this room? I'm going to have to find my way to an aisle, and then I'm also going to have to find my way to the door. It's not an easy process. And so what Justice Holmes is saying is yes, we have free speech, but even if we're going to actively protect free speech, that doesn't mean that we as a society are obligated to protect a person who causes a public panic by shouting fire in a crowded theater, and thus causing a melee of sorts where people are going to be trying to get out, hurting each other, climbing over each other. They can't see in the dark. They can't find the door in order to get out. And so therefore, even though a person in a well-lit room very quietly whispering fire, right? My students can look around in that room, in my classroom, and they know that I'm just making a point. There's no fire. They're sitting at individual desks so they can more readily get up. They know where the door is because they walked in the door. The room is light. There's obviously no fire, and I'm not screaming it. So I can say that because I'm not causing a panic. But the man who falsely shouts fire is causing a panic, and thus his speech is not protected. What is a rationale for forced internment in wartime? Well, on December 7th, 1941, the Japanese military attacked Pearl Harbor, which is in Hawaii, but Hawaii was not a state at the time, but it was a territory of the United States. Consequently, that attack by the Japanese on Pearl Harbor and Hawaii was treated as it was an attack on the United States. And by attacking this military base in Hawaii, there was a large loss of life, and the United States up to that point had not entered World War II. World War II started in 1939, but it wasn't until this attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941, that the U.S. then reconsidered whether or not it wanted to be involved in World War II. So consequently, the next day, President Roosevelt went to Congress on December 8th, 1941, and asked Congress to declare war on Japan, as well as to declare war on other countries as well. But what we're going to be looking at here was intended to focus on U.S. citizens who were of Japanese descent. So President Franklin Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066 on February 19, 1942. And here we have an excerpt. The successful prosecution of the war requires every possible protection against sabotage to national defense utilities. By virtue of the authority vested in me as President of the United States and Commander-in-Chief, I hereby direct the Secretary of War. Now, after World War II, the position title and the name of the department went from the Department of War and the Secretary of War to the Department of Defense, or the Secretary of Defense. So the Department of War didn't go away. It went through a name change after World War II. Let's go back to the quote. I hereby direct the Secretary of War and the military commanders to prescribe military areas, to designate military areas, as he or the appropriate commander may determine, from which any or all persons may be excluded, which means that here we have specific areas that people may be denied entry to, and with respect to which the right of any person to enter a particular prescribed area, remain in, or leave shall be subject to whatever restrictions the Secretary of War may impose in his discretion. So this particular executive order makes no mention of anyone's race or ethnicity or background, but it was specifically designed to address what was considered a problem at the time, where U.S. citizens of Japanese descent were accused of siding with the Japanese government in this conflict, and thus were considered to be a danger to the United States. So whether a person was born in the United States as a natural-born citizen, whether they had never been to Japan, whether it was their parents or grandparents who were born in Japan, it didn't matter. If a person was a U.S. citizen of Japanese descent, then they were subjected to the terms of Executive Order 9066, which, based on this order, resulted in forced internment, where there were camps set up, particularly in the western part of the United States. There were camps set up where Japanese Americans were required to leave their property, leave their land, bring what little possessions that they could into these internment camps. And Japanese citizens who were living in the United States were deported. So most people in the internment camps were American citizens, but who themselves were born in Japan, or whose parent or grandparent was born in Japan. Another way that forced internment was experienced was with curfews. There were some areas of the country where there were not camps set up, that Japanese Americans were allowed to stay in their homes, but they were not allowed to be outside their homes at certain times of day. So this really affected whether or not they could have jobs, because some jobs would require that they stay to a certain time of day, or some jobs would require that you have to arrive by a certain time. And by arriving by a certain time, they couldn't do that if they couldn't leave their home before a certain time in the morning. So even though the focus of the benchmark and the focus of this excerpt focuses on forced internment, I did want to bring in that curfews were also something that were allowed by Executive Order 9066, even though the benchmark itself focuses on forced internment. So now we're going to look at the rationale for the suspension of habeas corpus. Habeas corpus translates from the Latin as show me the body. In other words, a person cannot be jailed without being told why they are being held in the jail. So what we have here is evidence of when President Abraham Lincoln, during the Civil War, suspended habeas corpus using his power as Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces. And here he's giving his rationale for the suspension of habeas corpus, for basically suspending the requirement that people had to be notified and charged with something, a crime, in order to be incarcerated or held in jail. First, during the existing insurrection, and as a necessary measure for suppressing an insurrection, all rebels and insurgents, their aiders and abettors within the U.S., and all persons discouraging enlistment to defend the country, resisting the draft, or guilty of any disloyal practice, giving aid and comfort to rebels against the authority of the United States, shall be subject to martial law and liable to trial and punishment by a court-martial or military commission. That the writ of habeas corpus is suspended in respect to all persons arrested. So what President Lincoln did in the first part, the first paragraph that starts with the word first, is he is outlining the circumstances of those people who will be subjected to the suspension of habeas corpus. And these people will continue, who are now or hereafter during the rebellion, shall be imprisoned in any fort, camp, arsenal, military prison, or other place of confinement by any military authority, or by the sentence of any court-martial or military commission. So even though this excerpt includes a lot of words that are really difficult to get our heads around, we have a better understanding of why would President Lincoln suspend a right that is protected in the U.S. Constitution, which is protection from a writ of habeas corpus. And here we see his justification or his rationale for that. Thank you for joining me for Middle School Civics Highlights. Do you still have questions? Please contact us using the information that appears on the screen. Till next time, I'm Dr. Terry Susan Fine. Thank you for joining me.